Racist manager refused service to a black woman. She did the unthinkable. Before we dive into this shocking story, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The bell above the door chimed faintly as she stepped into the jewelry store, the soft tinkle barely audible over the hum of ambient music that filled the space. She walked with purpose, though the atmosphere immediately felt foreign to her, a stark contrast to the warmth of the sunlight outside. The store was immaculately designed, with all gleaming glass displays and pristine velvet-lined counters. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and luxury, an aroma that should have made her feel like she belonged. But as she crossed the threshold, a palpable shift occurred, unnoticed by all except for her. She wasn't sure exactly what it was that set her apart from the other customers. Perhaps it was the faint but unmistakable looks she received from the staff as she moved through the store. It wasn't overt, but there was something in the way they looked at her, just a second too long, before quickly turning away. She ignored it at first, focusing on the dazzling rows of diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires, hoping to lose herself in their brilliance. But the unease clung to her, thickening with every step. As she moved closer to the counter, her eyes scanning the intricately designed pieces, the store attendant behind the counter greeted her with a polite yet distant smile. It wasn't a welcoming smile, the kind that made you feel at ease. No, this was the kind of smile that masked something darker, an artificial politeness meant to mask a quiet judgment. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Can I help you with something?" the attendant asked, though her eyes flicked over her shoulder, glancing at her manager, Richard, who was hovering in the corner. The woman smiled politely, but gave no immediate answer. She knew what she wanted, but the hesitation in the attendant's voice told her that any request might be met with an unseen obstacle. "I'm just browsing for a gift, something special," she said, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of frustration she couldn't quite place. She picked up a delicate bracelet, examining it with a practiced hand, though her mind was elsewhere. The attendant looked uncomfortable, but nodded, still avoiding direct eye contact. "We have many fine pieces," she said. "Please let me know if you need anything." It wasn't long before the tension in the store seemed to deepen. She wasn't sure if it was her growing discomfort or if something in the air had shifted, but the interactions felt increasingly cold. She walked over to the high-end display, where more expensive pieces were arranged. Her fingers hovered over the glass, admiring the intricacy of a platinum necklace, its diamonds glinting in the light. She wasn't in any rush. She wanted to take her time to indulge in the rare moment of luxury. But she noticed the attendant had begun to move away, offering assistance to another customer nearby, a white couple who had just entered the store, their laughter light and carefree. She stood there alone, a faint unease settling into her chest. It wasn't the first time this had happened, being ignored, being dismissed as if she wasn't a potential customer. She had experienced it too many times before to be surprised, yet it still stung. Her eyes flicked toward the manager, Richard, who had been watching from the corner. He was now standing straight, his posture stiff. He hadn't said a word yet, but his body language spoke volumes. His eyes narrowed slightly as he observed her, and the faintest trace of a smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. That's when she realized she wasn't just being ignored, she was being marginalized. She was an outsider in this space, and Richard was the gatekeeper who had already decided she didn't belong. She wasn't welcome here, not because she didn't have the means to buy what she wanted, but because her presence itself seemed to provoke discomfort. She moved towards another display, her steps deliberate, forcing herself to stay calm. But as she reached for a set of earrings, the attendant who had been serving the couple shot her a glance, a look that seemed to say, "Don't touch that." She could feel her heart rate increase, the simmering anger rising up, but she forced herself to breathe, to ignore the insult. Richard finally approached her, his steps quiet but purposeful. She had anticipated this moment. He'd been watching her, waiting for the inevitable confrontation, and now it was here. "Ma'am," he said, his voice colder than it had been before, "I'm afraid we don't have the type of jewelry you're looking for here. Perhaps you'd prefer to check out somewhere else?" His words were polite, but they carried an unmistakable tone of dismissal. She froze, caught between the need to respond and the urge to walk out of the store immediately. The message was clear. She wasn't being served here, and her presence was, at best, an inconvenience. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, her voice rising just slightly, incredulous. "Are you saying you don't have anything in my price range, or are you just assuming I won't be able to afford it?" Richard's smile didn't falter, but there was a sharpness in his eyes now. "We don't have jewelry of your type, ma'am," he repeated, his tone dismissive. "So if you'd like, I can help you find something more appropriate." Her cheeks burned, the sting of the insult too real to ignore. She wasn't just being ignored now, she was being rejected in front of the other customers. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air as she looked around, realizing she was the only one in the store not being attended to. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just an accident. This was deliberate. "I see," she said, her voice steady now, though the anger simmered just beneath the surface. "I don't think I'll need your assistance any longer, but thank you for your time." She turned to leave, but as she moved toward the door, the words came, sharp, cutting through the tension of the moment like a knife. "Perhaps you should check your bag," Richard said, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. The words were spoken with such casual authority, as if he were making a routine suggestion, but the implication was unmistakable. "Just to be sure." The words hit her like a slap to the face. Her breath caught in her throat as her body stiffened, her hands tightening around the handle of her purse. She had been humiliated, singled out, and now this accusation. But before she could respond, her hand already reaching for her phone, ready to record the moment, Richard stepped away. The attendant flinched but said nothing. The tension in the air was thick now, unbearable, as she struggled to keep her composure. She had been pushed too far. The moment had arrived. This was no longer about jewelry. This was about something deeper, something that could no longer be ignored. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone, the cold steel of the device grounding her in the chaos of the moment. The phone felt heavier than usual in her hand, but she forced herself to focus. The anger swirling inside her was nothing new. She had faced it time and time again, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. With her phone in hand, she turned to Richard, the weight of the accusation still hanging in the air. His eyes flickered with an almost imperceptible shift, a slight tightness in his jaw. He knew he had crossed a line, but he seemed far too proud to apologize or back down. Instead, he looked at her with that same patronizing smile, his earlier smugness returning, as if the whole situation had somehow been justified. "You really think I'm stealing?" she asked, her voice sharp and controlled, despite the knot of emotion in her chest. "Is that what this is about, Richard? Because I'm black?" There it was. The unspoken truth. The accusation. She wasn't just being treated poorly because she had asked to see some jewelry. She was being accused of stealing simply because of the color of her skin. It wasn't just disrespect. It was a racial stereotype, one that she had fought against for years, but one that still reared its ugly head in moments like these. Richard's face shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it didn't last long. He looked around the store as if searching for support, his gaze landing on the attendants, who now seemed unsure of how to react. The couple by the counter, who had been so carefree just moments ago, were suddenly tense, their eyes darting between her and Richard. "I never said you were stealing," Richard replied, but there was a nervous edge to his voice. "But you should understand, ma'am, that sometimes we have to be cautious." He was fumbling now, trying to backpedal, but it was too late. His earlier words, the way he had dismissed her, the way he had treated her like she didn't belong, she could hear them all in his tone now. He was trying to cover up something much worse than a simple misunderstanding. She held up her phone, her thumb hovering over the record button. "Caution?" she repeated, incredulous. "Or is it just because I'm the only person of color in this store and you thought I wouldn't notice?" The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. The tension was suffocating. The quiet murmur of the store faded away as the staff went still, watching her every move. Even the couple who had been chatting in the corner suddenly seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. The light from the overhead fixtures now seemed harsh, illuminating the space as if the store itself were bearing witness to the injustice unfolding. "I'm going to record this," she said quietly, her finger pressing down on the button. The sound of the camera starting to record was faint, but it made the situation feel all the more real. It wasn't just her frustration and anger anymore. It was proof, evidence, something concrete that she could use to show the world exactly what was happening to her at this moment. Richard's face drained of color as the screen of her phone flashed to life. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice a bit higher now, the veneer of authority cracking. He took a step forward, but she held her ground, the phone steady in her hand. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. "You're accusing me of stealing," she said, her voice now firm, a calm, the kind of calm that comes with an inner strength that has been forged through years of experience. "You need to be held accountable for that." Richard opened his mouth to say something, but his words caught in his throat. He was the one who had always held the power here, and he was suddenly confronted with something he hadn't prepared for. He wasn't just dealing with an upset customer now, he was facing someone who would not be silenced, someone who was ready to expose him for the bigotry he had tried to hide behind his white-collar position. He took another step closer, his hands outstretched as if to disarm her, but she quickly took a step back. "Don't touch me," she warned, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. The air between them was electric with the tension of unspoken truths and past injustices. And then, just when she thought it couldn't get worse, Richard made the mistake of making eye contact with one of the attendants, a young woman who had been quietly observing the situation from behind the counter. She had been silent up until now, but in the stillness of the moment, her face contorted, an expression of guilt and remorse crossing her features. "I don't want any trouble," the young woman said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but it was enough to shift the atmosphere in the store. Richard looked over at her, startled as if he hadn't expected any dissent from his staff. He was the manager, after all. He was in control, but this was no longer a matter of control. It was about right and wrong. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and she could see the hesitation in Richard's expression. It was only for a split second, but it was there. And in that fleeting moment, she saw the crack in the armor. It was a crack, but it was enough to make him realize that he had made a fatal mistake. "Perhaps I should leave," the young woman added, her voice steady now, her resolve strengthening. "This isn't right." Richard turned to her, his face flushed with frustration. "You're not going anywhere," he snapped. But even as the words left his mouth, he realized they no longer held the same weight. He was on the wrong side of this, and his attempts to regain control were slipping through his fingers. She didn't leave. Not yet. Not until the injustice had been fully exposed. And as Richard stood there, suddenly unsure of how to proceed, the weight of the situation came crashing down on him. The recording had already begun, and she was about to make sure that what had happened here today wouldn't be forgotten. Part 3. The Reveal. The silence in the store deepened, almost suffocating. The sound of her phone's camera recording was the only noise, filling the charged atmosphere with an undeniable tension. The seconds seemed to stretch, each one thick with the weight of what had just unfolded. Richard, the manager, looked around at his staff, hoping for some support, but all he found were faces filled with uncertainty. The attendants, once passive in their roles, now seemed divided, unsure of how to handle the situation they were witnessing. The couple near the counter, who had earlier been oblivious, now watched with wide eyes, taking in every word, every gesture. Richard cleared his throat, his voice now much less confident. "You really think this is necessary?" he asked, his tone defensive, even weak. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. She stood tall, holding her ground as she faced him, her phone steady in her hand. "I think it's necessary because you've accused me of something I didn't do," she said, her voice calm but full of intent. "And you did it solely because of my skin color." The words hung in the air, cutting through the noise in her mind and the tension in the store. The racism that had been subtly embedded in the way he spoke, in the way he treated her, was now out in the open. She wasn't just a customer being ignored or dismissed, She was someone who had been humiliated, stereotyped, and judged in a way that went beyond mere service. And this time, she would make sure the world knew it. "Look, I didn't mean." Richard started again, but his words were falling apart, and they were getting weaker with every second. He hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't expected her to stand up to him like this. And he certainly hadn't expected her to record it all, turning the entire situation into undeniable evidence. "You didn't mean?" she repeated, her voice growing colder. "No, Richard. You knew exactly what you were doing, and I'm not leaving here until everyone knows exactly what kind of manager you are." She paused, taking a step back to ensure she had a full view of the room. Her eyes swept across the store, making sure to lock eyes with each of the staff members who had been complicit, if only by their silence. The tension was palpable now. There was no denying what had just happened. There was no getting around the fact that she had been targeted for something as trivial and cruel as the color of her skin. Richard shifted uneasily from foot to foot, his hands instinctively reaching for his pockets, then pulling away in frustration. He was used to being in control, used to dictating the environment of his store with an air of superiority. But here, in this moment, he wasn't in charge. He wasn't the one holding the power. "Don't make this worse," he muttered, more to himself than to her. But his words had lost their force. His authority had crumbled, and all that was left was the reality of his actions. But she wasn't done yet. She took another step forward, closer to him now, as if she were drawing the line in the sand. "What will you do now, Richard?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "Will you apologize, or will you stand there and pretend you didn't make a mistake?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The weight of his own choices seemed to be pressing down on him now, suffocating him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had expected her to back down, to apologize, to leave without making a scene. But here she was, standing firm, demanding accountability in a way that left him powerless. The staff, still watching, began to shift uncomfortably. The young woman who had spoken earlier looked between Richard and the woman with the phone, her face showing a mix of guilt and recognition. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but it was clear to her now that the situation couldn't be brushed aside. It was a moment of reckoning, and she could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. "I'm calling the police," Richard said, his voice strained. "You can't just accuse me like this." But she wasn't backing down. "Go ahead," she replied, her tone cutting. "Call them. I'll let them know exactly what happened here." And then something unexpected happened. A voice from behind the counter spoke up. It was the young attendant who had been silently watching the whole time. "You don't need to call the police," she said, stepping forward, her voice softer but full of resolve. "I saw what happened, and it wasn't right." Richard turned sharply toward her, his eyes flashing with disbelief. "What are you talking about? You're not even—" "I'm not finished," the attendant interrupted, taking a breath before continuing. "I've worked here long enough to see how you treat certain customers, how you treat people who don't look like you, and this isn't the first time." Richard's face paled, his eyes widening as the attendant's words sank in. He had thought he could control the narrative, manipulate the situation, but now the cracks were showing. His own staff was turning against him, and the truth was unfolding in front of him, whether he wanted to accept it or not. The attendant turned to the woman with the phone, her voice now more resolute. "You're not the problem here. He is." The words were like a spark in the room, igniting a quiet revolution within the store. The energy shifted again, and for the first time, the woman felt a flicker of hope. She had expected isolation, but now, for the first time, she felt as though she wasn't alone. The silence stretched again, this time filled with the weight of realization. Richard stood there, floundering for words, as the attendant's quiet support turned the tide. The other staff members exchanged uncertain looks, unsure of how to react, but the truth was undeniable now. The balance of power had shifted, and the woman with the phone? She wasn't going anywhere, not until the truth was heard. Part 4. The Unraveling. The stillness in the jewelry store was almost unbearable, each second stretching as the magnitude of the situation began to sink in. Richard's face flushed crimson as he turned away from the attendant, his voice sharp with a desperation he hadn't yet shown. The young woman's words had struck a chord deeper than he'd anticipated. His authority, once unchallenged, had been completely undermined. His hand reached for his phone, shakily, as if trying to regain some control by calling the police, but his thumb hovered over the screen, unsure. "You're really going to call the police now?" the woman with the phone asked, her voice cool but pointed. "Is that your solution? Make this an even bigger spectacle, Richard." She didn't wait for his response, her eyes now scanning the room once more. She could feel the eyes of the other employees on her, some of them watching with a quiet admiration, others uncertain. The young attendant had spoken up, and it seemed like the floodgates had opened, even if just a little. Richard stood motionless, his hand still hovering over his phone. A brief, tense moment passed as the weight of his own actions seemed to press down on him. He realized now that there was no quick escape from this. The walls were closing in, and the situation wasn't going to go away just because he tried to control it with a phone call. The woman shifted her stance slightly, moving with a calm, measured grace that contrasted sharply with the raw emotions still boiling inside her. "You've been in charge here, Richard, haven't you?" Her words dripped with irony. "You've made the rules, you've set the tone, but now you're the one being called out. What will you do?" Richard's voice faltered as he looked at the attendants, his eyes darting nervously between them. I didn't mean to." He seemed to stumble over his words, no longer the confident manager, but a man cornered by his own choices. The store had never felt smaller than it did in that moment. The young attendant who had spoken up earlier stepped forward again, her voice stronger now. "You didn't mean to? Richard, how many times have you done this? You don't just get to say, 'I didn't mean to,' after everything you've put her through." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring him to deny them. And for the first time, Richard couldn't. The woman holding the phone stood silently, letting the conversation play out. She had already turned her focus inward, watching the dynamics shift. It wasn't just Richard who was now uncomfortable. It was everyone. The attendants, who had once stood by, uncertain of how to act, were now divided. Some were clearly uneasy, avoiding eye contact with their manager, while others, like the young woman who had stepped forward, stood resolutely by her side. Richard, feeling his authority crumble further, shifted his attention back to the woman. His voice cracked as he finally managed to say, "This isn't the way to handle things." "You're right," she responded, her tone unwavering. "But this is how it's going to be handled. You're going to take responsibility for what you did." Richard took a shaky breath, his hand still on his phone, but now it seemed like it was more for show than anything else. The room was thick with the weight of truth. There was no escaping the gravity of what had just happened. The woman with the phone wasn't going to let him slink away unscathed. The store was so still that the faintest sound seemed amplified, her shoes clicking on the polished floor as she stepped toward the door, her phone still recording. The staff watched her every movement, as if waiting for some sign of what would come next. But then, just as the situation seemed to reach its boiling point, a voice called out from the back of the store. "I think it's time you leave, Richard." It was a calm, steady voice, one that had no place for hesitation or fear. It was the voice of a woman who had been in the background up until now, an older woman who had witnessed it all. Her voice was commanding, yet laced with quiet authority. Richard turned sharply toward the voice, eyes wide with surprise. "What are you talking about? You've embarrassed yourself enough today," the older woman continued. Her tone was matter of fact, as though she were speaking to someone who had lost the respect of their peers. "We don't need your kind of leadership here. Not anymore." The words hit like a thunderclap. The store went even quieter, if that was even possible. The weight of the older woman's words seemed to shift the atmosphere completely. Richard, whose face had been flushed with frustration moments ago, now looked paler, his bravado unraveling. "You can leave on your own terms," she added, "or we can call corporate and have them handle it." For a moment, Richard said nothing. The silence between him and the older woman stretched on, but it was clear the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. His decision now wasn't about managing the store, it was about how he would handle the consequences of his own actions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping. The fight had gone out of him. "I'm not going to fight you," he muttered. The door to the jewelry store swung open as the woman with the phone stepped outside, the cool air greeting her with a sense of relief. It was as though she had stepped out of a pressure cooker, the tension that had been suffocating her inside now dissipating. The sounds of the busy city street filled her ears as she took a deep breath, steadying herself. She hadn't won the battle by simply confronting Richard. She had made a stand. She had made it clear that this kind of behavior, racial profiling, prejudice, and mistreatment, would not be tolerated. But it wasn't over. It couldn't be. The phone in her hand vibrated, snapping her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from her assistant. "Did you get it? What's the update?" A quick, almost imperceptible smile flickered across her face. She had already made sure the video was being shared. She had no intention of letting this go unnoticed. The world would know what had happened inside that store, and she wasn't about to let them ignore it. Not now, not after everything she had gone through. Her thoughts were interrupted as she heard footsteps approaching from behind. She turned to find the young attendant, who had spoken up earlier, hurrying toward her. The woman's face was flushed, her expression a mix of apprehension and gratitude. I wanted to say thank you," she said, breathless. "I didn't know what to do in there, but when you stood up for yourself, I realized I couldn't just stay quiet anymore. I've seen things happen like this before, but I was too scared to say anything." The woman smiled gently, giving the young attendant a nod. "You did the right thing. You spoke up when it mattered. You have more power than you think." "I don't know if I'll be able to keep working there," the attendant confessed, biting her lip. "But I couldn't stand by and let it happen again. I don't think I can go back to the way things were." The woman regarded her with a thoughtful look. "You should be proud of yourself. Whatever happens next, know that you did the right thing. And maybe it's time for the rest of us to start asking some tough questions too." They shared a brief, meaningful silence, the weight of the conversation sinking in. The woman had stood up, recorded the injustice, and forced change in the moment. But the shift in the store had rippled out far beyond that single incident. The attendant had found her voice, and now she was questioning the place that had once felt like a safe haven for her. "You'll be okay," the woman added softly. "You're stronger than you think." As the attendant gave her a final, appreciative glance and turned to walk away, the woman took another deep breath, staring at the busy street before her. The world around her hadn't changed, not yet, but in that moment, she felt as though she had set something into motion. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message from her assistant. It was a notification from a news outlet. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the headline: "Footage of racist incident in jewelry store goes viral, calls for action grow." Her chest tightened with a mixture of emotions: pride, frustration, and a growing sense of urgency. This was far from over. The video was already sparking discussions, and people were demanding answers. But what was truly important now was not just the outrage or the viral reactions, it was the change that could come from it. The systemic issues, the behaviors that had been allowed to fester for so long, were now under scrutiny. And that was just the beginning. She looked back toward the jewelry store, knowing that the fight was far from finished. There would be investigations and there would be consequences, but she would be ready for whatever came next. This wasn't about a single store or a single manager. It was about making sure that people like Richard knew they could no longer get away with their actions. It was about standing up for every person who had ever been made to feel inferior or invisible because of their race. It was about demanding respect, equality, and accountability, even when it seemed impossible. The woman walked away from the store, a renewed sense of determination settling in her chest. The video was just the beginning. She had spoken up for herself, and in doing so, she had sparked something much larger. And she wasn't going to stop until real change had been made. Her phone buzzed once more, and this time it was a message from her assistant. "The mayor's office is on the line. They're asking for your statement on the situation." The smile on her face was steady now. It wasn't just the woman in the jewelry store anymore. It was the voice of someone determined to bring about real change. someone whose actions had spoken louder than any accusation could. She wasn't backing down. The fight was only just beginning. Part 6: The Ripple Effect. The following morning, the woman's phone rang relentlessly with messages, calls, and notifications from all corners of the city. The video of the incident at the jewelry store had gone viral overnight, spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. By the time she had answered her assistant's call, the shockwaves of her actions had already reached far beyond the store's walls. "Mayor's office is ready for your statement," her assistant said, voice steady but with an underlying sense of urgency. "They want to meet with you ASAP." She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. It felt like everything had shifted in the last few hours, and now it was time to decide what would come next. This wasn't just about one jewelry store or even Richard anymore. This was about systemic change, the kind that started with one person standing up, refusing to be silenced and demanding accountability. But how far could this momentum take her? "I'm on my way," she said, voice calm but resolute. She had already made up her mind. She wouldn't let this moment slip away into the noise of social media and empty outrage. It was time to turn this into action. The meeting at the mayor's office was tense. The mayor, a tall figure with a stern face, sat behind his large wooden desk, eyes fixed on the woman across from him. Beside him sat his press secretary, taking notes, while a few others lingered in the room, waiting for her statement. "We've seen the video," the mayor began, his tone measured but not unkind. "The reaction has been overwhelming, and frankly, it sparked something in the community that we can't ignore. But the question is, what do we do with this?" The woman leaned forward, her hands folded on the desk. Her heart raced, but her voice was steady. "This isn't just about what happened in that store. It's about what's been happening for years, in this city, in our society. It's about the treatment of people, Black people, who are constantly made to feel like they don't belong, that they're not worthy. But more importantly, it's about the systems that allow that treatment to continue unchecked. You can't just call it a one-time incident and move on." The mayor listened closely, nodding slowly. "I understand, but what are you asking for? What's the next step? We can't just arrest someone for this. We need a plan, a way forward." The woman's eyes never wavered. "I'm asking for accountability. I'm asking for real consequences. Richard has to be held responsible for what happened, not just for his actions, but for the environment he fostered in that store. The employees who witnessed it need protection, and this cannot just be swept under the rug. We need to use this as a catalyst to demand change in businesses, in policies, in the way people of color are treated in this city. We need to make sure this is the last time someone is made to feel inferior just for existing." The room was silent for a moment as the mayor digested her words. The press secretary scribbled down notes, clearly impressed with her conviction. A few others in the room exchanged glances, murmurs of agreement bubbling up from unexpected places. The ripple effect was spreading. "I'm not going to lie to you," the mayor said, breaking the silence. "There will be pushback. People will resist this kind of change. But if you're serious about this, about making this bigger than just one store, we'll support you. We'll put together a task force, investigate the store, and see what we can do. But we need you on the front lines, leading this." The weight of the responsibility hit her, but she knew this was her moment. She had stood up once. Now it was time to lead others in this fight for justice. "I'll be there," she said with unwavering determination. "I'll lead, but we need to keep the pressure up. We need to hold businesses, leaders, and institutions accountable. This isn't just a moment, it's a movement." The mayor nodded, his demeanor softening. "Then we're with you." As she left the mayor's office, her heart pounded, but it wasn't out of fear anymore. It was out of the knowledge that something had started. Something big. The city was changing, and she would be at the center of it. By the afternoon, the pressure was building. A local news station had already picked up the story, and protesters began to gather outside the jewelry store, demanding justice. Social media was alive with outrage, and people were sharing their own stories of similar mistreatment. The hashtag #StandWithHer was trending, and even major civil rights organizations had reached out in support. Richard had become a symbol, but he was also the first casualty in what was beginning to look like a widespread movement. The jewelry store had already issued a statement, but it felt like damage control. The public didn't want apologies. They wanted action. The phone calls kept coming, and more meetings were set. The next step wasn't just about fighting one battle. It was about transforming the way the city, and beyond, dealt with issues of racial prejudice. She was now leading a crusade that many had only whispered about, but she knew it was just the beginning. This wasn't going to be an easy fight, but she had already come this far. She had been the spark, and now the fire was spreading. She looked out the window of her office, seeing the bustling streets of the city, but now it felt different. The world was watching. She wasn't going to let them look away. Not this time. As the dust settled and the truth unraveled, the stunned silence in the jewelry store spoke louder than any words ever could. What began as a moment of quiet discrimination had turned into an unforgettable reckoning, one that no one in that store would ever forget. This wasn't just about jewelry. It was about respect, about dignity, and about the consequences of underestimating the wrong person. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that needs to be heard. And tell us, where are you watching from? Because stories like this deserve to be told, and together, we make sure they are. As she left the mayor's office, her heart pounded, but it wasn't out of fear anymore. It was out of the knowledge that something had started. Something big. The city was changing, and she would be at the center of it. By the afternoon, the pressure was building. A local news station had already picked up the story, and protesters began to gather outside the jewelry store, demanding justice. Social media was alive with outrage, and people were sharing their own stories of similar mistreatment. The hashtag #StandWithHer was trending, and even major civil rights organizations had reached out in support. Richard had become a symbol, but he was also the first casualty in what was beginning to look like a widespread movement. The jewelry store had already issued a statement, but it felt like damage control. The public didn't want apologies. They wanted action. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring him to deny them. And for the first time, Richard couldn't. The woman holding the phone stood silently, letting the conversation play out. She had already turned her focus inward, watching the dynamics shift. It wasn't just Richard who was now uncomfortable. It was everyone. The attendants, who had once stood by, uncertain of how to act, were now divided. Some were clearly uneasy, avoiding eye contact with their manager, while others, like the young woman who had stepped forward, stood resolutely by her side. Richard, feeling his authority crumble further, shifted his attention back to the woman. His voice cracked as he finally managed to say, "This isn't the way to handle things." "You're right," she responded, her tone unwavering. "But this is how it's going to be handled. You're going to take responsibility for what you did." Richard took a shaky breath, his hand still on his phone. But now it seemed like it was more for show than anything else. The room was thick with the weight of truth. There was no escaping the gravity of what had just happened. The woman with the phone wasn't going to let him slink away unscathed. The store was so still that the faintest sound seemed amplified, her shoes clicking on the polished floor as she stepped toward the door, her phone still recording. The staff watched her every movement, as if waiting for some sign of what would come next. But then, just as the situation seemed to reach its boiling point, a voice called out from the back of the store. "I think it's time you leave, Richard." It was a calm, steady voice, one that had no place for hesitation or fear. It was the voice of a woman who had been in the background up until now, an older woman who had witnessed it all. Her voice was commanding, yet laced with quiet authority. Richard turned sharply toward the voice, eyes wide with surprise. "What are you talking about? You've embarrassed yourself enough today," the older woman continued. Her tone was matter of fact, as though she were speaking to someone who had lost the respect of their peers. "We don't need your kind of leadership here. Not anymore." The words hit like a thunderclap. The store went even quieter, if that was even possible. The weight of the older woman's words seemed to shift the atmosphere completely. Richard, whose face had been flushed with frustration moments ago, now looked paler, his bravado unraveling. You can leave on your own terms, she added, or we can call corporate and have them handle it. For a moment, Richard said nothing. The silence between him and the older woman stretched on, but it was clear the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. His decision now wasn't about managing the store, it was about how he would handle the consequences of his own actions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping. The fight had gone out of him. "I'm not going to fight you," he muttered.